Oh, all right. We're going to take this Bible study on the birth of Jesus from the Gospel of Luke because he gives us the clearest historical markers. Even though Matthew, we have the name Herod the Great, and we know from history the years that Herod the Great reigned. But let's look at this, the Gospel of Luke. Now, Luke was not one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. So who was Luke? Well, he was a Christian. He had a medical background because he's often referred to as Luke the doctor. And Luke joined Paul on Paul's second missionary journey. Paul had gone through on his first journey and established churches in Asia Minor throughout that area, and then came back, and after this council in Jerusalem, Paul went on a second missionary journey to tell those churches what that council had decided. And on that journey, that's when Luke met up and actually traveled with Paul. In Acts chapter 16, verse 10, it actually switches from they to we. That's when Luke actually joins Paul and begins to travel with him. And so Luke becomes an eyewitness. And then we're going to find out how Luke gets information because he wasn't there when Jesus was born. But the book of Luke and the book of Acts, because Luke is the author of both. The Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts are both books that Luke wrote. And he got the information, some in the book of Acts as an eyewitness, and the other information he got from interviews he conducted with the believers he met along the way who were eyewitnesses. So Luke provides information about the birth of Jesus that the only way he could have known is that he either interviewed Mary directly or he interviewed someone that Mary had told the whole story. And so he got the details, but his source has to be very close to Mary herself, if not Mary herself. And he actually states his purpose in both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts as he wants to write an orderly account so that the believers can know, be sure of the things that they've been told. So he was somewhat of an investigative reporter, and that's how we have the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. Now, where does the story begin? Well, from the last book of the Old Testament, which is the book of Malachi, until the beginning of Luke's account, which would be the birth of John the Baptist, and because Luke begins with the story of John the Baptist's parents, Zacharias and Elizabeth. This is called the intertestament, or between the two testaments, between the Old Testament and between the New Testament. And that period was 400 years. From the book of Malachi until the first gospel of the New Testament, when during that time was 400 years. And sometimes they call it the 400 years of silence. But during this time, during this 400 years, Alexander the Great was the world conqueror at the time. Greece was the world dominant at the time. And on his way to Egypt, Alexander the Great conquered Palestine. And so this is how the Jews in the Palestinian area were immersed in the Greek culture, especially the Greek language. Because the New Testament, the letters of the New Testament are all written in Greek, even though all the main characters are Jewish. So you would think that they would be writing in Hebrew, but because the Greek culture had pretty well completely Hellenized, they use the term Hellenized the Jews, a lot of the writings that we have in the New Testament, the original language, are written in Greek. So, but before the story of Luke actually began, the Greeks were in control a little over 300 years. In the year 63 AD, or 63 BC, excuse me, the Roman general Pompey, because Rome had come to power about 100 years before the New Testament story begins. And so the Roman general Pompey conquers Jerusalem in 63 BC. So when the story begins, John the Baptist and the birth of Jesus, Rome is in control of Palestine and not Greece anymore. And it was actually the Roman Senate that had installed Herod the Great, the king that refurbished the temple. This was the actual temple that was used during all the New Testament stories occur in the temple that King Herod built. And King Herod was established to rule the Judean state by the Roman Senate. So, more directly into the story of Luke and the birth of Jesus. That's just some of the background information. This is right from Luke chapter 1, and this is where Luke explains his purpose. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. What does that tell us right there? He wasn't the first one writing the gospel. He must have been aware of the Gospel of Matthew, or the Gospel of Mark, or maybe even the Gospel of John. But he knew that others were already writing about the life of Jesus, because that's why he said others have undertaken to draw up an account. So, and he said, just as they were handed down to those who from the first were eyewitnesses. So he's acknowledging that people are trying to get the eyewitnesses' account on record so that they can be preserved. And he says, with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything. So, and we're going to have to assume how he did that was conducting interviews with the people he met and talking about what they remember hearing, seeing, about what Jesus said and did. He says, he investigated everything from the beginning. And this is true. He has details from the early life of Jesus and even John the Baptist's parents, that no one else has. Mark, the Gospel of Mark doesn't have them. Matthew has a little bit about the birth of Jesus, the story of the Magi, and a little bit about the story of Mary and Joseph. But Luke has the most detail about the early life of Jesus than anybody. And it's because he sought that information. He wanted to know what those beginning days were like. Then he said, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. Theophilus may have been a code word because Christianity wasn't yet legal in the Roman Empire. And Theophilus means a lover of God. That's what the word means. It could have been a person, and it could just mean to anyone who loves God. I've sought to write an orderly account for any of you who love God, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. And here's how he begins. In the time of Herod, king of Judea. That's our historical marker. And these names, Herod, king of Judea, is mentioned in many non-biblical sources. Archaeologists, they have records of historians that wrote during those times. So the names of these people are not just in the Bible. They're in historical documents just as old as the Bible. But in the time of King Herod, Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah, who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah, and his wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. But both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive. She was barren. And they were both very old. So during this time, since he places Zacharias and Elizabeth during the reign of King Herod, it's known historically that Herod reigned in Jerusalem from 37 BC to 4 BC. That's, just about 41 years altogether. So, and if you remember from the Bible, John the Baptist was a cousin of the Lord Jesus, and they were only 6 months different in age. So that means that John the Baptist and Jesus was born during this time, sometimes towards the latter time of King Herod. How do we know that? Well, here's how we fill in the details. King Herod died in 4 BC. And remember Matthew, in the book of Matthew, when the wise men or the magi or the astronomers, when they came to visit, they were following the star and they came to Jerusalem. And they said that they announced that they were here to worship the king of the Jews because they had seen his star in the east. Well, Herod was kind of shocked. I mean, he was the king. He was appointed there by Rome, and he didn't like to hear about this promised king being born. He called the scribes and found out that according to the prophecy, the child was to be born in Bethlehem. And so he sent the Magi, these wise men, go find him, and then when you find him, come back and tell me, where he is. And of course, his intention was to just use the information to kill him. And we know, if you remember the story, the Magi found Jesus, but they didn't go back to King Herod. And King Herod ordered his troops, when he realized he was tricked, to kill everyone in Bethlehem, in that whole region around Bethlehem, every male child 2 years old or less, because he thought he'd make sure he wanted to catch that way he would make sure that the king didn't live. But Joseph and Mary were warned in a dream and fled, and they fled to Egypt until King Herod died, and King Herod died in 4 BC. So if you put those two stories together, Jesus had to be born right around the 1 BC or 0, or right at between BC and AD, and that's how you get this AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. That's how they determine about when Jesus was born, because it was shortly before Herod died. Maybe we're not sure how old Jesus was when they fled. He was about 2 years or under what they figure when he fled to Egypt. We don't know how long he lived in Egypt, but so sometime in that period, within 4 or 5 years, they're fairly certain they know the approximate time when Jesus was born. And there's another historical marker, and Luke adds this as well. And this is in chapter 2, where Luke writes, in those days, Caesar Augustus. By the way, Caesar Augustus was the first Caesar. It's when they went from a republic to an emperor ruled the Roman Empire. So he was the first Caesar. And this Caesar issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. And this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was the governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. And we know that Caesar Augustus ruled from 27 BC to 14 AD. So that during the same time period that King Herod had been installed as king over Judea, Caesar issued this decree. And this decree was likely for the purpose of raising taxes, but the Greek word for taxes is not actually used. Some of our English versions say that the world be taxed, but that's not what it says. Luke only uses the word to register, to be written down. And so it was clearly a registration of the population. It was a census. Caesar Augustus wanted to know how many people were living in his empire. And so he required a census be taken of every province that was under Rome's control. He was basically assessing the whole extent of his population. And at this time, the person that would have been responsible for Syria was a guy named Quirinius. And so he would have been the one that was in charge of making sure that everyone registered. And this decree is found in multiple non-biblical documents. Several historians from that time mention this decree. So these things, just so you'll know, these are not fairy tales that someone made up. These are historical events that happen in specific places at specific time with names that are not only found in the Bible, they're found in non-biblical historical data. Now, why does Luke mention the census, this registration? Why does he mention that? Well, he gives the census as the main reason that Joseph is forced to travel with his very pregnant wife, Mary, from Nazareth, his hometown, or the town where he was staying. It's actually not his hometown, but that's interesting, but it's the town he was staying at. And he had to take Mary, who's late in pregnancy, from Nazareth to Bethlehem, and the journey would have probably been a week On foot or on mule? Now, you ladies have been pregnant in your 9th month or late month, how would you enjoy riding a mule for 7 days and camping out in the at night? It's not a very loving thing for a husband to do. And it's not something that Joseph probably would have done had he not been required to. But I want you to think about how amazing this is. God knows how to fulfill the prophecies in his word. And the prophecies about Messiah being born was that he was to be born in Bethlehem. But Mary and Joseph are in Nazareth, 7 days away, late in pregnancy. And if God had not moved upon the Caesar of Rome to declare a census, it may not even, the prophecy wouldn't have been fulfilled in this way. It's just amazing when you understand the things that go into the story. Now, Joseph's family, as I said, because Joseph was from the tribe of Judah, so was Mary. But so if Joseph was from Bethlehem, because the Bible says that that's where his hometown was, Bethlehem, why were he and Mary in Nazareth? Have you ever wondered that? What were they doing there? What were they doing in Nazareth if his actually hometown was Bethlehem? I pondered that question, and I've got a theory so we can ponder together. Well, let's first, before I tell you what that theory is, let's look at the significance of Bethlehem. That's the English way of saying it, Bethlehem. In Hebrew, it's Bayit Lechem. Bayit is the Hebrew word for house. Habayit, the house. And Lechem is bread. Habayit Lechem, the house of bread, is Bethlehem. It was a region. Bethlehem was in the center of a region that was famous for its wheat production. And we first hear about Bethlehem, the city, in the book of Ruth. You remember the book of Ruth? The two main characters, Naomi and Ruth. Naomi had her husband and her and her 2 sons. There was a famine in the land of Judah. They were residents of Bethlehem, and because the famine was so severe, the family moved to the land of Moab. And there in the land of Moab, they obtained 2 wives, 2 Moabite wives for their sons. And one of the wives that they obtained from Moab for their sons was Ruth. Well, both of their sons died in Moab. And so Naomi's husband died. So here she is, the mother. She's got 2 daughter-in-laws, and she's living in a foreign land without anyone to support her except her daughter-in-laws. And she decides she's going to go back to the place where she came from. And she decides she's going to go back to Judah, back to Bethlehem. But she tells her daughters-in-law, look, I can't provide for you. Don't wait. I can't have another son for you. Go back to your family. One of the daughter-in-laws does, but Ruth doesn't. That famous statement, no, where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. So Ruth and Naomi, the 2 of them travel back to Bethlehem. And that's the story where Ruth meets a guy named Boaz. Remember the story? This is because Ruth, if you didn't realize it, Ruth is the great-grandmother of King David. Ruth meets Boaz there in Bethlehem, and they marry. And the Lord gives the 2 of them a son, which Naomi, the mother-in-law, named. Isn't that interesting? And Naomi named their firstborn son Obed. And Obed had a son, and he named him Jesse. And Jesse is the father of King David. So you first hear about the family of King David in the book of Ruth. And where is the center of the story? Bayit Lechem, Bethlehem. And then there's another famous place for the story of Bethlehem, and that's in the book of Samuel. Now, David is the most famous king in Israel, but David was not the first king of Israel. Saul was the first king of Israel, but Saul had disobeyed the Lord, and it displeased the Lord that he had made Saul king. So his spirit departed from Saul, and he sent the prophet Samuel to the house of Jesse in Bethlehem to anoint one of Jesse's sons to be the next king of Israel. So here in Bethlehem is where Samuel goes to the house of Jesse. He sees Jesse's sons, ends up, we'll cover a little bit more of the story in detail later, but ends up anointing David, the youngest son, to be the next king of Israel. So Bethlehem is very significant as in the story of David's family, the lineage of David, the famous king of Israel. That's why Bethlehem is known as the city of David. That's why it's called that. And in this particular city, the prophet Micah is one of the minor prophets in the Old Testament. Micah made this prophecy. But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come one for me, who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are of old, from ancient times. Therefore, Israel will be abandoned. Remember the 400 years of silence between Malachi and the New Testament? That intertestament period? Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labor bears a son. Isn't that interesting? No mention of the father. What does that remind you of? A virgin shall conceive, and a child shall be born to her, until she who is in labor bears a son. And this is the passage that was quoted in the Gospel of Matthew. Remember when King Herod, when the wise men, which were probably astronomers, when they showed up in Jerusalem and asking, where is the king born to the Jews? We've seen his star in the east and we've come to worship him. And of course, Herod doesn't like to hear that, but he doesn't know. He's not necessarily a very religious king. So he calls the priests and the scribes and asks them, where the king of the Jews was to be born. And they actually quoted to him the passage in Micah. He's supposed to be born in Bethlehem. So since the wise men found out that Bethlehem was the place they were to go, they began to head towards Bethlehem. It says they saw the star, and the star came over the house where he was, and they found the child, not the infant. Just a detail, they found the child, not the infant, in a house, not the stable. The wise men were not at the birth of Jesus. They were about 1.5 to 2 years after the birth of Jesus. Jesus and his family were living in Bethlehem in a house when the wise men showed up. And the idea of 3 of them, we don't know. We don't know how many there were. There were probably several as they traveled in a group. So where do we get the number of 3 from? Well, because there are 3 gifts mentioned: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so when people pictured in their mind, one gave gold and one gave frankincense and one gave myrrh. We don't know if that's how it was. We just know that they're using the plural. There were wise men, astronomers. So we know for certainly there were more than one. We know they traveled together. And we know that these wise men, these astronomers, were warned in a dream not to go back to Herod. So to give Mary and Joseph and the child Jesus time to escape. Now, interesting. How is it that these astronomers would have even known what to look for? How did they recognize a star? And how did they know about a future king? These were men from the east, more than likely the area of Babylon. And that's the eastern extreme usually of that region. Anybody have an idea of how they would even have known about a prophecy of a future king, that they would recognize a star? Sam?
Daniel.
Yeah. In the book of Daniel, Daniel was one of the wise men in Babylon, high in the king's service. And Daniel had many revelations about the future of Israel. And I think it's from Daniel that they had records to be looking for the fulfillment of a promise when a future king would reign. And so these men kept looking for that, these astronomers, and whatever this special star was, they recognized it, and they traveled all the way from the east, following the star, to the land of Judea to worship the king. You had a question, Priscilla?
The slide before, is there a scripture reference to all that you have in there?
About the Gospel of Matthew? Yeah, Matthew chapter 1. Yeah, Matthew chapter 1 and 2. You can read about it. Because Matthew is the one who mentions the wise men. Luke doesn't. The story of the wise men is mentioned by Matthew. Mm-hmm. And so by combining the stories together, and can you see what men have done? They've combined the stories of the shepherd and the wise men, and they put it into one. And that's why all the nativity scenes have all the characters together at the stable. Don't fight over that, okay? Come on, that's just people putting all the elements of the story into one little package, and that's how people remember it. But just know the details. The wise men were later, about 1.5 to 2 years later. They didn't end up at the stable. They ended up in Jerusalem.
Why do they call them wise men?
Because that's kind of what it's a difficult term. The Greek word is magi. It's just, we're just trying to describe, evidently they were men that were considered special, had special knowledge, like the philosophers of their day, or the astronomers, or, they were men who studied the stars, and yeah. That's kind of why they're called wise men. It's just a term, we're just trying to describe them.
It's not that they were rich. I don't
Well,
know
more than likely they had money. Yeah, more than likely they had money. To be able to travel like that takes some money. Now, the significance of the angels and shepherds. So the wise men were later. They weren't at the stable. Okay? But let's look at the significance of these details that Luke had. Why do we have these details? We just assume, we always heard about the shepherds, but why are the details important? And I'm trying to make you think, in God's mind, why would he preserve to us these details? When you read the Bible this way, and you go beyond the words on the page, and beyond the information, and you begin to contemplate and search and wonder, I wonder why the Lord would do that. Things can be shown to you that you wouldn't get from just casual reading. Now let's go back to Joseph and Mary. How ostracized they must have been. And what do I mean by that? Well, suddenly Mary is found to be with child. Now she hasn't been married yet. She's engaged to a very righteous young man named Joseph. Of course, an angel appears to her and says, you're going to have a child, and what's she going to do? Just walk over to her fiancé and say, hey, guess what? An angel appeared to me, and I'm going to have a child. I mean, put yourself in that position. It must have been terrifying for her to wonder whether she should say anything or not. But then what's going to happen? She stops menstruating. So she's discovered to be pregnant. Well, she has to tell Joseph something, but he doesn't know, and he doesn't believe her at first. We find this out from Matthew. The details in Matthew said Joseph had planned to divorce her privately. He could have, because it was a violation of the law. When you're engaged to someone, having sex with someone else before marriage was committing adultery. In the Old Testament, it was the death penalty, but at this time, they don't think Rome was allowing the Jewish people to carry out the death sentence. But it was severe. Joseph did not believe Mary, because Mary probably tried to tell him that an angel had appeared to her, and this thing in her was a miracle. But it took God appearing to Joseph in a dream. Because Joseph, it says he had planned to put her away privately because he was just a kind man. But the Lord appeared to him, and an angel appeared to him in a dream and told him that the child within Mary is from by the power of the Holy Spirit, and he was to be the Son of God, and that Joseph was to give him the name Jesus. And so that's the only reason that Joseph did not put Mary away. And the angel told Joseph, don't be afraid to take Mary to you as your wife. So they went ahead and got married, but everyone knew in Joseph's family and Mary's family that Mary was pregnant before the two of them got married. And then suddenly Joseph's not going to divorce her like he should. He's a righteous man. And the right thing to do if you love God, you're living with this girl who's been unfaithful, divorce her. No, he doesn't do that. He marries her. What would you think as a family? Yep. We know who the child it is. You're not divorcing her because that's your child. You two have been hooking up before marriage. And how do you think it brought them with their whole family? Mary's family and Joseph's family. Now, if Joseph's from the town of Bethlehem, might that explain what he and Mary are doing in Nazareth? Because they're ostracized from their home. What are they going to do? Tell their family, but this is from God. We have Messiah. This is Messiah living in us. This is not, we were not being unfaithful. Can you imagine the position they're in? Think about it. So then they likely made this journey alone. There's no mention of any family going with them. So it's not surprising that it probably took them longer. She is far along in her pregnancy. They leave from Nazareth to go because a census is required for them. They have to register in the town of their birth. And Joseph was born in Bethlehem. And so they're not being helped by family. But at least they're going home where all their family's from. That's good news, right? Well, it probably takes them longer to get there. Traveling alone, you probably can't go very fast because of her condition. So they're later to arrive at Bethlehem. And it says they couldn't find any accommodation. But you got to remember, this is their hometown. This is where their family lives. So not a single family member offered them a place to stay. I mean, you arrive with your wife, and she's 9 months pregnant, and no one has a bed for them. Are you reading the story? Thinking it through from their point of view. There's no one there. There's no mention of anyone there to welcome them, to receive them. They were very likely alone, outcast because of this pregnancy. We know it is the greatest thing ever, but it was a stigma to them. It was like the Scarlet Letter, if you ever read that Bible, that old novel. Because this pregnancy happened before they were officially married. So the best thing that they were offered, and it says that there's no room. And it's interesting. What do you say when you don't want someone to stay with you? We don't have any room. You've always assumed it was true. We don't have any room. I think it's because you ain't staying with us. Not after what you've done. Well, those are ideas. We don't know for sure. But what we do know is no one gave him a room. Even, can you imagine Joseph as a husband, a young husband, about to be a father, in his mind, his wife's about to have a baby, and no one had let him even inside. So, someone, there's a stable. That's what we call it. These are terms. It's a niche. It's a place, because that was a hilly area. They probably carved out a shallow cave basically where animals could get in and out of the rain. Okay, we'd have straw or hay, straw on the floor, and feed and some animals in there. At least a little bit of a shelter. Okay, somewhere behind the main house. But that's it. That would have to do. I mean, Mary is evidently in labor. I mean, in the midst, can you imagine? There's no place to stay. She's in labor, and so Joseph doesn't have a lot of options, and he settles in best he could. All right. So let's review. They traveled alone. Now they would labor alone. No midwife. No parents to help them. No cousins. No brothers and sisters. No friends. They're alone. No one to rejoice with them. No one to help them at the birth. Births were family events back then. There's no family here. None. But God was watching. Think. Even though none of their family was there to welcome them. And to get this, Mary and Joseph don't even know this is going on. They're in the throes of having a baby. And while that's going on, God is declaring the birth of his son. He sends, and he started this by a star rising. Now, this star was rising when Jesus was being born, and it took time for these magi to come. So the heavens start declaring the glory of God. We already talked about how they know this. And angels were being dispatched to announce the news. Now, again, remember, Mary and Joseph are alone. They don't know this. They're just trying to make it through this night, and there's no one there to help them. But God knows. God has not forgotten them. These angels that God sends, he doesn't send them to Jerusalem. He doesn't send them to the capital. He doesn't send them to the priest. He doesn't send them to the king. Who's he send them to? A group of shepherds. Shepherds were the lowest occupation in Israel. That was the poor man's job. And this angel is sent to these shepherds who are out in the fields near Bethlehem guarding their flocks during the night. This is from the internet, a study. In ancient Israel, shepherds were generally considered unclean in the community of God's people because of the work they did. They were in daily contact with dirty, smelly sheep. Their manure, their blood from cuts and scrapes, and the insects that buzzed around them. All of this meant that shepherds were almost never clean enough to worship with God's people and God's presence. So they were almost always considered as outsiders. So the two outcasts are having their baby alone, and God is sending a special messenger to another societal outcast, these shepherds out in the field. Yeah.
No, I was just saying where it says all of this meant that shepherds were almost never clean enough to worship in God's people's, with God's people in God's presence. Who made that rule up?
No, that's just a description. It's just that what he means were, when you touch blood and things like that, there's times you're unclean for so many days according to the law. It just meant it made it very difficult for them to really intermingle with society regularly. It was a pretty lonely life back then. And this is just a general description of the historical conditions. But, in wondering why the Lord chooses to send the angel to shepherds rather than the priest or anyone else, I just began to wonder. And this is an idea that I just have that I'd like you to consider. The idea may point back to King David. You remember that David was from Bethlehem, And you remember what David was doing when he was before he was anointed as king of Israel? Yeah, he was out with the sheep. When the prophet Samuel showed up at Jesse's house with his jar of oil to anoint, at first it was all Jesse's older sons were there. And of course the first one that Samuel saw was Jesse's oldest son, and he thought, oh, surely this must be him, because he was just beautiful and handsome and tall, strong. But the Lord told Samuel, no, that's not him. And then, so Samuel looked at every other son there at the time, and the Lord told Samuel, it's none of them. And Samuel's confused. Samuel turns to Jesse and says, is this all your sons? And Jesse says, well, there's only one, the youngest, but he's out in the fields with the sheep. And Samuel says, you go send for him. We're not sitting down until he gets here. And when David shows up, Samuel sees he's a young man. He's a handsome appearance, kind of a ruddy, kind of a outdoor, kind of a handsome young man. And the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Samuel, and he anointed David king over there, even though he had been out in the fields with the sheep. And it's just, you wonder about these details, and this would be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years apart. So why would we have these details left to us? I think it's because God wants us to know how he can connect the dots, and he can determine how things happen. And besides, it is the middle of the night. And if you want to make an announcement to someone because you have in mind something for them to do, you would choose someone who's awake. Well, the shepherds would have been out in the fields keeping watch. That would mean they would have been awake. Now, why do you think the other purpose of God sending a message to the shepherds would be? Let's go back to where are Joseph and Mary at this time? They just had a baby. Mary's just had a baby. And they're in a stable. But the baby is in a trough, a feed trough. That's what a manger is. It's a feed trough. And they wrapped Jesus in swaddling clothes, and they laid him in a manger, a feed trough. That's where Joseph and Mary are. Alone, no family, no help. No one knows they're there. And I wonder how alone they feel. They don't know about the star rising in the east. They won't know about that for a long time. They don't know that there's an angel being sent to talk to shepherds until something happens. Now I want you to imagine, now back there with Joseph and Mary, when suddenly, in the middle of the night, all alone, they may have had a candle light for light. They could have been sitting there in the dark. We don't know. You got to be careful with fire and where there's straw and hay around. You hear noise, and some shepherds show up. They're the first people you've seen, in this crazy situation you're in. And these shepherds tell them they've seen an angel. And an angel told them they'd find the two of them there, and that they'd find their son right there in the feed trough, just like that. And suddenly, Joseph and Mary know maybe their family didn't know and understand, but God did. God knew where they were. And he wasn't ashamed. And he was announcing the birth of his son to the world. Can you imagine the reassurance it must have brought to the two of them when they realized that, wow, it's true. All of this, you know, what they've been through. If you put yourself in her position, Mary's position and Joseph's position, Mary would have never forgot, never, these things, these details. Luke uses the phrase, and Mary treasured up these things in her heart. Because look for how long she had been in a place where no one understood. Where she couldn't explain to anybody that what was in her womb was the child of God. And suddenly, complete strangers show up to worship the child of God. And wow. And so she treasured these things in her heart until the day when she would be able to tell her story. Because people would believe it. And that may have been years and years and years later. But I think we know who one of the persons, thankfully for us, who she told that story to. And that person was Luke. And Luke wrote it down for us. So that we could understand the details. That they may seem insensitive. It's something we're so familiar with that it's almost like, well, that's just the neat part of the story. No, it's actually quite amazing. All the details, the way they fit together, and how they make the story come alive, you know, or special. It just takes some time meditating and pondering and thinking about it. So, you know, this is just a taste of it tonight for you. But I encourage you to delve into it even more.